Hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation today, Creating Inclusive Workplace Practices for Dyslexic Employees and how we can better support them and their managers. I'm super excited to be able to present to you all the way from Melbourne, Australia. I was really sad that I wasn't going to be able to be there in person to present and to meet all the wonderful people that are attending this conference. So thank you again for inviting me to come along. Before I get started, though, I would like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I live and work, and they are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander or First Nations people that are attending this conference and my presentation today. I'm Shae Wissell, and I am the CEO, director, of Rethink Dyslexia, my company, and I'm also the chair of the charity I founded 7 years ago called Dyslexic. And I'm currently a doctoral student with Trobe University. But I'm excited to say that once I finish this presentation, I'll be hitting the submit button and I will be submitting my thesis, which is 6.5 years of work into looking at the lived experiences of adults with dyslexia. And so I'm really excited to be able to share some of my research with you today that comes out of my thesis. So I mentioned that I started my thesis 6.5 years ago now. It feels like a lifetime. So much has happened in between then and now. I was diagnosed with dyslexia and dysgraphia at the age of 27. And so today I bring with you not just my research, but also my lived experience of what it's like to have a hidden disability like dyslexia and dysgraphia. After I was diagnosed with dyslexia and dysgraphia, I had what I would call my first and hopefully only ever mental health breakdown. I had gone through all of my primary and secondary education and also my undergraduate degree of speech pathology without being diagnosed. But I officially became dyslexic in 2007, although I had been born this way. But my formal diagnosis was following Lisa, who was my tutor at the time, and I'd had many tutors throughout my education, but particularly when I went to university because I failed and struggled with a number of subjects. It was one night while we were sitting at my dining table. I remember it very, very clearly. My dad had made this table, and so it sits with me, this memory. But my tutor at the time, Lisa, could see I was getting really frustrated because I couldn't write the sentences and I couldn't understand the content that I was working on with her. And my letters were jumbled, my spelling was jumbled, and I was getting really frustrated and agitated. And I felt a lot of shame because I wasn't able to do the basic things that other people could. And Lisa could see me struggling, and she could see the frustration, and the tears were welling in my eyes yet again. And what we found was that she thought that I could possibly be dyslexic. And so I went back to university where I was studying at La Trobe and got a diagnosis, as I said, at age 27 with dyslexia and dysgraphia. What I found after I was diagnosed with this was there was a real lack of support and understanding of dyslexia as not just a condition, but I didn't know anyone at the time. I didn't know how to talk about it. And I really felt like I'd lost my sense of identity because I had gone through all these years without being diagnosed. And all of a sudden I had now this label of a disability. And I really didn't know who I was anymore. I was going through a bad marriage and divorce at the time. And so I really felt I'd lost my sense of self and my place in the world. And when, before I was diagnosed in my graduate year as a speech pathologist, I was terribly bullied by my manager because she couldn't understand why, and I couldn't understand why either, why I couldn't understand the way things were written. I couldn't spell the words. And even though I was really, really good with my patients and loved working with them, I really struggled with the case notes, keeping up with all the readings, and would have to work back late to keep up with everyone else, as well as working through lunchtimes and doing a number of other coping strategies to be able to get through the day. So after I left my graduate year, I didn't know what to do with myself. And that's why I went back to do my master's and when I got diagnosed. But after I was diagnosed, what I didn't want to do was not tell the truth anymore. I wanted people to know when I went into a job why I was struggling and that I wasn't dumb and stupid like I felt, that actually there was a reason why I couldn't do things like other people. But what I found during my working career was every time I disclosed my dyslexia, I would come up with a number of barriers, whether it was I wasn't paid the advertised salary because I'd asked for support during an interview. I was told that there was something wrong with me when I disclosed that I was dyslexic. And I even lost my job during the performance, during our 6-month probationary period because of my dyslexia. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to get any help for losing my job because legally employers are allowed to do that. So in 2017, I started the Dyslexic Foundation, and initially it started with podcasts, sharing stories of other adults with dyslexia, because I thought surely I couldn't be the only one facing these challenges. And it was really only because of my beautiful mum, who's no longer here with us, who got me through my education and got me through university. She would proofread everything. She would go through my work with me. And as I progressed through my thesis, my auntie would do the same. And really all the work that I do now is in honour of my mum, who was also a teacher, but also a fierce advocate for her dyslexic students and her children. Because not long after I was diagnosed, we found out my brother was dyslexic, and we actually found out that my dad was dyslexic. So it's really strong in my family, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But at the same time as starting the podcast, I went to uni and said I would like to do my doctorate in the space of adults with dyslexia, with particular focus in the workplace. And that's what brings us here today, is not just my research, but also my personal experience, because what I found is that my story isn't unique. The mental health challenges I've faced over the years are similar to many other dyslexics, and the types of barriers that I have faced throughout my working career, as you'll hear today, has resonated with my story. So I really hope that you learn some interesting facts about dyslexia that you didn't know, but most importantly, considering we're at an inclusive and diversity conference, that you're able to take some of these lessons and back into your workplaces to see how you can better support and understand your dyslexic employees. So dyslexia is, before we get into dyslexia, actually, what I'd like to just talk about is the fact that dyslexia sits under the term neurodiversity. And this is a term that we're hearing so much about now across the globe and in Australia as well. So neurodiversity is a cultural movement, and it was coined by a lady called Jill Singer, who first started using the term to explain the differences that people with autism have. And over time, that has grown to encompass other neurodevelopmental disorders such as dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, ADHD, and a variety of others. So dyslexia makes up 50% of the population. And as I mentioned, it is an umbrella term. And as this new language appears or is used more, we're seeing more and more conditions start to sit under this umbrella. So Tourette's is another example, chronic fatigue as well. So there's a variety of different conditions sitting under the neurodivergent umbrella. But what we know is that at the moment, dyslexics make up 50% of that population. So it's very, very big, and we are everywhere. So I wanted to share this video with you because I'm only here I only have a short period of time, and I thought this was a really good snapshot of what dyslexia is and isn't. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so I can actually share the sound with you. And then I'll just show you this video quickly.
Your brain is amazing, and nobody else has one quite like it. Although everybody's brain looks the same, they all work differently from each other. Just as we all have different color skin, hair, and eyes, we all have a brain that's individual to us. Like a fingerprint, we have different personalities, tastes, strengths, and weaknesses. Our brains can even see and understand the world in different ways. One of those ways is called dyslexia, which affects how the brain handles information it sees and hears. Dyslexic people may find it difficult to match letters to sounds and to remember how to spell words. They may even see letters moving around when they're reading. They might have trouble telling left from right. Remembering lots of instructions can be especially hard. They may need more thinking time to remember the right word.
Chicken! No, wait. Duck!
As well as memorizing sequences. It may be difficult for them to hold a pencil and to write by hand. Even organizing themselves can be difficult. But everyone with dyslexia is different. It can affect how people feel about themselves. When they struggle with a task that other people find easy, they may feel frustrated, angry, or sad. Some dyslexic people try to hide their difficulties because they are worried about what others will think of them. However, thinking differently can be a really good thing. A person with dyslexia may be very good at seeing patterns and solving problems, imagining and rotating objects in their heads, telling stories and making people laugh, taking things apart, understanding how they work, and figuring out how to put them together again. Inventing, drawing, painting, and making things, seeing the bigger picture. Dyslexic people can do a lot of things. They just might do them in a different way to how others would, and many of them have even become famous for it. There have been many famous dyslexic inventors, writers, scientists, business people, astronomers, paleontologists, actors, cooks, singers, artists, architects, and so on. Dyslexic people have changed the world. See dyslexia differently.
That's a really nice video from the British Dyslexic Association that gives a great snapshot of not just the struggles that we face, but also the strengths that someone with dyslexia can bring. So as I talk through this presentation today, and you're thinking of your own workplace, thinking about, what are some of the challenges you might see for your dyslexic employees or if you're dyslexic yourself, but also what we're really wanting to come from is a strength-based approach. So what are the strengths that individuals, regardless of having dyslexia or not, bring to the workplace? So dyslexia is a specific learning disability. As I mentioned earlier, I was born with it and we are born with it, and it's neurologically based in nature. And 1 in 10 people will be affected or have dyslexia. So that's a significant number in the population. I think in the US and the UK, they're starting to say 1 in 5. There's a number of reasons why there's variation in the prevalence of dyslexia across the globe, and some of it comes down to the way that we're assessed. Different countries assess dyslexia in different ways, and also there's different terms and labels used to talk about dyslexia. So some of the labels you might have also heard include reading disorder, specific reading impairment, specific language impairment. I think in the US it's called a specific learning disability. And in Australia, it's also known as a specific learning disability. And so dyslexia fits under that umbrella term, and so does dysgraphia and dyscalculia and dyspraxia. And we are protected under the Discrimination Act, and in Australia also our Fair Work Act and the Human Rights Act, which means that we can't be discriminated, we shouldn't be discriminated against, but it's happening all the time. And that's why it's really important that we have the opportunity to talk about my research and talk about this type of work around the world so we can start to reduce some of that discrimination. But what we know is that dyslexia is a phonological processing difficulty. So we have troubles putting sounds together to make words. And so this can impact our reading fluency, our reading speed, and our reading comprehension. It is often and most of the times genetic. As I mentioned, it's very strong in my family. So my dad, we suspect it came from, my brother has it, and then two of my nephews also have dyslexia. Even though the prevalence rates between boys and girls are pretty even, it may appear that there's more boys that have dyslexia because of the way that they externalize their difficulties during their schooling. Girls tend to fly under the radar like I did, where boys might act out. And if you look at my family, there's a lot of boys compared to just me that are dyslexic, but we also have more boys in our family than girls. But there's a high chance that my daughter, who's 2 at the moment, could be dyslexic. Is 33 to 66% likelihood or chance that a child that has a parent that's dyslexic will be dyslexic themselves. So when we're looking at family units, whether we're teaching or in the workplace, we've got siblings, we can see that there can be a flow-on effect in families, but also that it's unlikely that just one person has it. It's more the norm that you'll have more than one person in the family, and you'd be able to trace it if they haven't had formal diagnoses. It has nothing to do with intelligence. We know that now. And it's well established that dyslexia is not caused by poverty, speech or hearing or visual impairments, developmental delays, or learning a second language. And we know that despite excellent education and explicit instruction, those with dyslexia will have these ongoing challenges. So we know that intervention is the key in reducing or mitigating these challenges as we progress through our education and into adulthood. For me, being dyslexic, I really struggle. So my reading fluency is, my reading comprehension is really good. I love to read. It's one of my favorite things to do when I have time, which is not very often. But for me, the letters will move on the page. So B's and D's will flip and I'll get to the end of a sentence and I'll have to reread it and I'll know where the word changed. But that takes me extra time to have to read articles or reports or books. And so then my reading fluency starts to slow down and my reading speed. I also have difficulty reading aloud as well, and my spelling and grammar are quite poor. So although dyslexia is a reading-based difficulty or disability, depending on what term you'd like to use, there's also a number of variety of other challenges that we may face that you may not be aware of. So like autism, dyslexia is on the spectrum from mild through to severe. And this can be because someone might have had intervention when they were a child, and so their dyslexia doesn't impact them as much, or they could have done quite well at school, but as they progress to more complicated language, that's when they started to struggle. So it is on the spectrum, but what we do know is that it affects a number of different areas. So spelling, as I mentioned already, people that have dyslexia, so their spelling will be impaired. They might miss E's and D's or get their tenses wrong. That's something I tend to do. Writing, so for me, my dysgraphia impacts me more when it comes to writing. So I would say I've got, a significant writing difficulty. And I used to say to my mum after she'd read my work, can you see my writing's improving? And she'd say, not really, sorry. And she wasn't doing that to be mean, but and it has improved, particularly after finishing my thesis. But there's always those general mistakes that I make that I just can't see. So it doesn't matter. You can tell me to proofread till the cows come home and reread my work, but I just won't pick up those mistakes. Along with spelling is also grammar, like I mentioned before. When we look at motor control, you might not think about it, but those with dyslexia might have poor handwriting. So my handwriting is really poor and illegible. People may not be able to actually read their own writing once they've written something. And if you ask someone to get up on the whiteboard to write in a working environment, it's going to be really challenging for them, not just because of their spelling and their writing structure, but also it'll be illegible. You can't understand it. It may take longer for people to also process instructions. When we're looking at memory difficulties, it might take someone longer to process instructions. They may have difficulty remembering more than 2 or more instructions at a time as well. So that short-term memory can really be impacted. But if over time it gets embedded into our brains, our long-term memory is actually really, really good. I find that mine is, and I can recall events from my childhood that my sister just thinks I've made up because she just can't remember. And you'll find that most dyslexics over a period of time will have that stronger long-term memory, but our short-term memory initially is quite impaired. So, remembering sequences of numbers is really difficult. You get the code sent on your phone and you've got to transcribe it into another app or something like that. I'll have to go back 4 or 5 times to be able to get the numbers or have to write them down because I just can't retain that in my brain. Also, when we're thinking about dyslexia, background noise can be really challenging for people. So if you're in an open planned office and you've got a lot of talking going around, it's really hard to concentrate. So most of the time you might find someone with dyslexia might have headphones in, or they'll need to sit in another room if they need to focus, particularly if it's on reading or a writing task. And my favorite part of being dyslexic is spatial temporal issues. So left-right confusion. If I'm in the car and I say to my husband, go right, it's normally left. I get lost really easily. So thank goodness we've got Google Maps, but even then Google Maps doesn't get you to the exact points. I'll still be walking around trying to find what side of the street it's on. And so that takes time. I get lost really easily and I can't judge distances. So I can't tell if I'm reverse parking a car, the distance, or I couldn't tell you the distance in a room or explain space to you. I get really confused and can't articulate it. So not everyone with dyslexia will have these types of difficulties, but it's very common to have some or more of them. But, definitely our spelling and our reading and our writing is impaired. And then these other, and our memory, these other areas can be different for everybody. And just quickly, as I mentioned before, with the umbrella term of neurodiversity, we know that those with dyslexia will usually have one or more co-occurring difficulties. So whether it's ADHD, autism, dysgraphia, which is significant writing impairments, dyscalculia is significant mathematical issues. So really people with dyscalculia struggle to have functional mathematical skills. So they're financially, their numeracy levels are really low. And so they could struggle day to day with banking, or if you're thinking of the workplace and you've got to use Excel spreadsheets or struggling with calculators, staff rostering, looking at FTE, full-time equivalent ratios and things like that, that someone with calculia could really struggle in that area. And then developmental coordination disorder, which we still call dyspraxia in Australia, is difficulties with motor coordination. So again, some impaired handwriting, but also will be quite clumsy. So they might not, when they're a child, have difficulties with doing their shoelaces up. They might learn to ride a bike later. They might have poor ball coordination as an example. And so I really thought that I would have dyscalculia and dyspraxia because I'm extremely clumsy and my maths is terrible. But my maths is functional enough where I can manage day to day. And then speech and language disorders are also commonly associated with someone that has dyslexia. But someone with a speech and language disorder will also have verbal or expressive difficulties, where those with dyslexia generally won't have those verbal, expressive, oral language difficulties. We're usually quite articulate. It's just when we're trying to put our thoughts on paper that things become muddled. And so then you start to see a mismatch between someone's ability. And then overarching all of this is our mental health and well-being. And research tells us that those with dyslexia are twice as likely to have depression and anxiety, and 46% more likely to attempt suicide compared to the rest of the population. And my research conducted just within the Australian population also identified that we had lower levels of mental well-being compared to the general population. And this was looking at positive psychology factors. So did we feel loved? Did we feel confident? Did we, I'm trying to think of the other domains now, there were 14 of them, but overall our life satisfaction was lower, which is quite distressing. And if you add all the other layers of what the research is finding at the moment, then there's a lot of barriers we're already facing when we're coming into the workplace. So now let's look at employment in Australia for adults with dyslexia and young people as well. So my research initially was just looking at the retention process for adults with dyslexia. Actually, as we started to do our research, what we found was those with dyslexia were having difficulties across the employment life cycle. So from recruitment all the way through to moving on to another job. This is a quote from one of my participants during their recruitment process. So they stated that I failed the government test. So in Australia, we have pre-testing for some roles. So it could be psychometric testing. I mean, it's very common around the world to do these pre-testing. And so this is what this participant's referring to. I failed the government test. After the test, two ladies sat in front of me and said, "You don't look dumb. We've never seen anybody fail a test as bad as this." And I said, "Well, I'm dyslexic," as I dropped my eyes. So what are some of the challenges that you might see for someone who's dyslexic in the workplace? So if you think about the different characteristics that I talked about, particularly around spelling, reading, and grammar, you might then start to see someone's emails are poorly structured. And reports can also be poorly structured. They might appear to be careless in the way that they present work to you as a manager. And you may think it's quite sloppy and lazy, but in actual fact, for someone who's with dyslexia, they may have spent twice or three times as long as someone else constructing that email or writing that report. And so as they have to start doing this extra work to try and keep up to the standard of their colleagues, you start to see mental fatigue come in and significant mental fatigue over time. They might seem disorganized, or especially if you're seeing them work longer hours compared to their peers, they might be needing to work through lunch, start early, finish late so that they can keep up with the workload. They may have difficulties in meetings, such as taking minutes, because if you're asking someone with dyslexia to take minutes, you're asking them to retain that information in their short-term memory, which we already said was difficult for them. You're also asking them to write when they know that their spelling and grammar is impaired. And so they'll be very busy. They'll be concentrating so much on getting their spelling and grammar right that then they start to miss the conversations. And then if you're asking them to participate in a conversation as well as take minutes, it can become really quite taxing on someone. If you think of in the work environment, just like asking anybody to take minutes and participate is quite a lot to do. But then if you're overlaying that with dyslexia, it becomes quite challenging. You might find that your dyslexic staff or team members are reluctant to get up to write on a board in front of everyone and take notes for everybody. And I don't know what it's like in Canada, but I know that a lot of our training workshops, you put into groups, someone has to write it down, someone has to present it out to the group. And so some of these tasks can actually be really quite anxiety provoking for someone with dyslexia. For me personally, I would get my mum to read my work if it was an important report. So I'd send it out of the organisation, and my research found that that's what lots of people were doing to be able to maintain their workload. And I also was heavily reliant, and still am, on work colleagues to help proof check emails and other work that I'm doing. So constantly needing some additional support. And you'll find that your team members could be doing the same. So for this body of work, what we did was looked at the job demands resource model of burnout, because what I wanted to be able to demonstrate that those with dyslexia in the workplace weren't just having difficulties because of their dyslexia, but there were underlying or overlying challenges that they were being faced with that was impacting them on a day-to-day basis. And so this model has been used around the world, and it's standardized now, and it's been used across multiple industries. What we found through my 3 different studies was that dyslexic people work across multiple industries at all different levels, from on-the-ground staff through to CEOs, board directors, really high up roles. And we found that it was a variety of industries, which is why we thought the job demands resource model was a good model to be looking at how they were managing in the workplace. And what we found is when people don't have a lot of job resources and they're faced with high job demands, so that could be poor working relationships, their dyslexia difficulties, the policies and procedures might not be inclusive of their disability, and so they can't access support needed. And just the general day-to-day trying to keep up with their work. So if they've got these high job demands and they're met with low job resources, so inability to access reasonable adjustments because of fear of disclosure, they have a poor working environment and they're having to implement their own coping strategies, then this leads to a low level of job resources and there starts to become a mismatch. And then this can lead to workplace stress and mental fatigue, exhaustion and anxiety, and then job burnout. So this can create a number of challenges in the workplace, because what we're seeing is that when we are retained and employed into a role, that there might become a mismatch of expectations from the manager and the employee's abilities. And you might see that some of their work is really, really good and some of their outputs are not meeting the expectation that is needed. We also found that regardless of the employment cycle, that people were fearful of disclosing their dyslexia. So in the recruitment practice, what we found was that those with dyslexia didn't want to disclose in case then they weren't offered the job. Also, sometimes people were disclosing and they weren't enabled the reasonable adjustments they'd asked for. So what we were finding was that they were already on the back foot and they weren't able to demonstrate their skills really well in an interview because they weren't getting those reasonable adjustments. And this had a flow-on effect for when they did get a job and were recruited, that during the onboarding process, they really struggled to understand the contracts they were signing and again, felt that they couldn't ask for reasonable adjustments. So they're already starting to face these high job demands based on poor organisational policies and procedures that's not being openly safe for someone to disclose that they've got a disability. So for that first 6 months, someone could be in real turmoil like I normally am, because I want to disclose so I can get the help, but I don't want to disclose in case I lose my job, because you can get terminated in that first 6 months. And so there's real, for me, I found this internal dialogue of should I, shouldn't I, because I may need the help because my coping strategies might not be strong enough for the role that I've taken on and I need those reasonable adjustments. And so we find that those first 6 months can be really challenging for someone once they've been recruited into a role and then onboarded and starting to learn their job. And so you can start to see why there can be so much workplace stress beginning to build up from the very beginning of being employed in a role. So as I mentioned, some of the challenges that people are facing when they're once they're in a job, and as I mentioned, my mum would do a lot of work for me, reading and proofreading of my work and editing. And then as I progressed in my career, I would get peers to support me. And at times in some of my roles, I was actually accused of other people doing my work and cheating because I was getting that editorial support that I needed from a human being. And so when you're constantly faced with those types of discriminatory barriers, it can really play on your mental health and well-being when you're in the workplace. And this is an example from one of our participants. How do I manage priorities of conflicting pressure and multiple tasks with the burden of writing and editing it? How do I get it done in time with an influx of work at the same time? The mental load that this has on someone who struggles to organize thoughts, prioritize tasks, juggle the plethora of parts, and it's an enormous mental load. So if you're thinking about someone that's dyslexic, they're not only trying to meet the demands of their day job, but if they can't disclose and they don't feel psychologically safe, then they're having to do all these additional coping strategies, which is leaving them feeling enormously exhausted and not meeting their own expectations. It's not just the manager and the employer's expectations, but we all have our own set of expectations that we want to work towards, and having dyslexia, not getting the workplace adjustments needed, can really impact on that. So then if we look at the team, so we've just talked about internalizing and the individual with dyslexia's challenges and how that may play out for them individually. When we're looking broader at the team, what we found was that there could be negative team experiences for someone who was dyslexic. And it was mixed, but the majority of the time it was negative. For some people, when they disclosed to team members, they were really supportive and helpful, and they got the editing support. They weren't questioned, they weren't judged. But for the majority of people, they felt that they were socially isolated because they couldn't participate in activities that the rest of the team could, because they were staying back late to do work. Because they had a heavy reliance on team members, some other team members felt that they were being lazy, or they weren't pulling their own weight, and they weren't being a team player. And if you can imagine like being in a meeting and someone says, oh, I'm not going to take the minutes, and they do it all the time, well, you think, well, they're not a team player. They don't want to help out. It's not fair that everyone else has to do this. Because if they don't feel safe to disclose to their team, then how's the team going to understand what's going on for that person? And it's the same with any disability, mental health condition. It could be that you've got personal things happening in your life, like my mum passing away. There's multiple things that are happening outside of our lives, and we don't always know about it. And so for those with dyslexia, they might also be carrying this burden of a hidden disability that they don't feel safe to talk about. And so that can really play out within team environments, and the friction can start to occur. So what does this mean from a manager and from an organisation level? So from a manager's perspective, they may be feeling, and what our third research paper spoke about was the fact that there's this mismatch in expectations from the manager, and the manager can also perceive the dyslexic employee to be lazy, lacking in attention, disorganized, all those things I mentioned already. And they may be quite frustrated. Like some of my managers have been really frustrated at the amount of work they've had to put in to edit. And they will constantly come back to me, even if I've disclosed I'm dyslexic, and say, this isn't good enough. This is not at the standard expected of a manager. And I've been in management roles. And regardless of the fact that I have a disability and that I need specific reasonable adjustments. So managers can be quite frustrated, particularly if that staff member hasn't disclosed. And then for some people, it can end up going down the path of performance management. And some of the work I do is around supporting individuals with dyslexia who are performance managed, and they've then disclosed they're dyslexic. So throughout their career, out their role, they're managed to manage, something's happened, and their coping strategies aren't working anymore for some reason, whether it's because they've been promoted, or a new manager's come on, or there's been changes in workflow or the way that they're supposed to work. And so the strategies they've put in place are no longer there to support them. And so then the manager starts to think there's something going on, and they end up being performance managed. And at that point, they disclose. And then at that point, the employer can't then terminate someone if they disclose they've got a disability. They have to put in reasonable adjustments, and they have to put in supports for that person to see if they can do the job once those supports are in place. So then that brings us to the organisational barriers, because if someone's too scared to disclose, then how are they going to get the support? And so from an organisation level, we need to be looking at what are the processes, the policies and procedures? What does our onboarding look like, our recruitment practices? Because if we look from the beginning of the employment cycle, if our recruitment practices are all written based, if they include pre-testing, if you have to submit a CV and the selection criteria, which everyone has to send through a CV at a minimum. But if there's no other formats, then you're already either missing out on a pool of really talented people because of your recruitment practices, or when someone gets in for that job interview, they can't demonstrate the skill set because of these barriers that are put in place. Then if we're looking at our onboarding and we've got all these written contracts and all the things I mentioned before, then for someone with dyslexia, they're at risk because they're signing off on things that they don't understand. And that's an organizational risk as well. So what policies and procedures can we be putting in place and looking at across the employment life cycle that enables someone to feel that it's an inclusive environment, that they're safe to disclose, and that they're going to get the support when they disclose without fear of discrimination and judgment. Because what I found through my research was that there is a significant lack of awareness and understanding of dyslexia from an organization perspective all the way down through to the employees. So it's across the board. And so that makes it really difficult for someone to want to disclose that they need help if these barriers are constantly put in front of them. So from an inclusion and diversity perspective, what are your organizations doing to include dyslexics? And do they have a place or a seat at your table when you're talking inclusion and diversity? Because what we're tending to see at the moment is we're being really inclusive of women in the workplace, and we're setting KPIs for that. We're setting KPIs for some disability and cultural and linguistically diverse and communities as well. But what we're not seeing is when we look at neurodiversity, we're only seeing it through the lens of autism at the moment. And really, it's so much broader than that. So if we're looking at our inclusion and diversity framework, how are we ensuring that the biggest population of neurodivergents are having a seat at the table? Because when we're looking at inclusive practices, majority of the times it's universal design principles where it's inclusive for everyone. These strategies that we can put in place to support dyslexics, autistics, people with ADHD, can also support people that English is their second language, and other minority groups that might need support, and not just minority groups. I mean, everybody can do with extra spelling support. Could be our education level, could be our cultural background. So thinking about how we can mitigate or reduce these organisational barriers from the very beginning for all of our employees, not just our dyslexic employees. So what does this look like then if we're thinking about dyslexic employees and reducing some of these barriers? Well, first off, if we don't reduce the barriers, we are going to be facing, and we already are facing, significant mental health conditions, not just in Australia, but around the world. But if we're looking at Australian workplaces, it's costing us $11 billion a year. And so if we know that our dyslexic employees are already coming in with lower rates of mental health and wellbeing, and then we're putting them in stressful work environments, you can see how this can lead to job burnout and significant workplace stress. So I've touched on this a little bit. I feel like I'm going over time, but I will quickly go through. So how do we make these, how do we make our workplaces more inclusive of dyslexic and neurodivergent employees? As we saw at the start with the video from the British Dyslexic Association, dyslexics come with a set of challenges, but also we have a set of strengths like any employee that comes into our organisation. We all have strengths that we bring, and we all have areas that we need to develop regardless of whether we're dyslexic or not. Could be a new type of job role we've applied for that we've been successful in. There could be components that we need to upskill in. So we need to think of our employees as, you know, we're all works in progress. Everybody needs some support. It's just that those with dyslexia need a little bit extra so that they can work to their full potential. And as we move into an era of artificial intelligence, we now know that there are a number of roles that could be reduced because of the advances in technology. But what we also know is that those with dyslexia tend to have strong right brain use. We generally, and these are generalizations, but I know myself, I'm an extremely good problem solver. We've got strong verbal communication skills. We're adaptable and we're flexible because we're having to change all the time to cope in these environments that aren't set up to support us. We're strong at critical thinking, visionary, strategic planning, interpersonal skills, and emotional intelligence and empathy. Though this is always a sticking point with my husband because there's a lot of dyslexics in our family and he does not think we're emotionally intelligent, but I beg to differ. So these are all really strong skills that we're going to need to be utilising as we move into an era of AI, because there's certain things artificial intelligence can't do. And those are the soft skills that we know dyslexics can be really good at in the workplace. And so when we're looking at recruiting practices and retention, and if people are self-disclosing because they feel psychologically safe, then we can start to look at, well, what are the strengths that we could be playing or using working with dyslexic employees, where we know that some of these process logical skills are going to be taken over by AI. What are some of these soft skills that they could be using to build out your company and to achieve your overall visions and goals for your business? So just quickly then, what are some of the strategies that we can use, particularly as managers, to support our dyslexic employees? I can't highlight enough, and I've mentioned it multiple times, around psychological safety. And psychological safety does equal high-performing teams, and it all comes down to trust. If we trust one another, then we're able to then build strong working relationships. When we don't have that trust from the very beginning and we don't feel safe to talk about our challenges, regardless of being dyslexic, but if we're not coming from a strength-based approach within an organisation, and mistakes are seen as failures rather than opportunities to learn, then we're really going to not be able to create psychological safe working environments, and we're not going to have high-performing teams. We're not going to have teams that work well together, and they're not going to achieve the goals and the aims of the organisation. So some of the research that we found was that even though organisations had inclusive and diverse committees, as I mentioned before, they weren't having dyslexics at the table, and they didn't feel that those committees and those areas within their workplace were really inclusive of them, and that they didn't feel that they were fitting in under this umbrella of inclusion and diversity. So as an organisation, we really need to think about, what does inclusion and diversity mean, and how can we ensure that dyslexics and neurodivergent people are included at the table. And as I mentioned before, universal design principles are so relevant when we're looking at supporting dyslexic employees, because, you know, an example is that one of the workplaces I was at, I used Grammarly, and they actually rolled it out for all the staff. And when I go to talk in organisations, a lot of them do that afterwards. And that's universal design principle, where everybody has access to the same tool and resource. So then you're not pinpointing, oh, that's a dyslexic, and they get Grammarly, and oh, that's the autistic, so they've got their headphones in. You know, everyone should be allowed to wear headphones, because sometimes we can't concentrate with background noise. Everyone should have access to grammar and spell check outside of Microsoft, because we all need additional editing support, particularly as we progress up in our careers. So some of these examples are tools that everybody can use, and it's not then isolating one subgroup within an organisation because of their difficulties. So just thinking for yourself and your organisation, you know, how are you making it inclusive for dyslexic employees? And these are some considerations for you to think about today as we finish this presentation. Areas like, how accessible is your website and your intranet? You know, comms and marketing strategies, is it all written text, or do you have other options for audio visual to ensure that you're meeting the needs of all your potential employees, not just those that are dyslexic or that have strong literacy skills? And looking at government legislation and regulations, are you meeting them by ensuring that those with dyslexia are able to disclose and then access the reasonable adjustments that they're entitled to? So dyslexia does not have to be a major barrier to success in any occupation. And when we're supported, and we're supported well, we're actually able to thrive. And our final study we did with managers and employers really demonstrated that when they knew their dyslexic employee had dyslexia and they could give them the right adjustments, that they just excelled and thrived in their role and could become real role models within the team environment. So we know they can succeed, and the workplace shouldn't be a barrier for them to succeed overall in life. So really, when we're thinking of inclusion and diversity, it's breaking down silos and stereotypes across different subgroups. And that's what I hope today's presentation has been able to demonstrate to you, that although dyslexics come with a package of strengths and difficulties, we really can thrive in the workplace. And I'll finish off there, and I will send through my 3 research papers that were published one in Australia and then 2 in the international public health and environmental research papers that look at the employee's perspective, those who have dyslexia, and the manager and employer's perspective today. I really hope you've enjoyed my presentation on how we can create more inclusive workplace practices for individuals with dyslexia. And please contact me if you have any further questions, or you're dyslexic and you need support yourself. We are a global organisation working to provide coaching and support services, and also to run training worldwide. So thank you again for having me. I hope you have a wonderful conference, and I hope next year I might be able to come to Toronto and present in person. Many thanks again, and stay well.